Hello, I am Jessica Darby, and I'm a newly minted assistant professor in the Department of Supply Chain Management at Auburn University. I'm excited to talk about my recently accepted paper in the Journal of Supply Chain Management titled The Implications of Firm-Specific Policy Risk, Policy Uncertainty, and Industry Factors for Inventory, a Resource Dependence Perspective. I co-authored this paper with Dave Ketchen, also here at Auburn University, as well as Brent Williams at the University of Arkansas and Travis Tokar at Texas Christian University. Prior to entering academia, I worked in the commodities industry where I saw firsthand how government reports, actions, and policies influence supply chain decision making. Over the last few years, we've seen an increase in this influence with the trade war, for example, or more recently, government efforts to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. These sorts of events led us to investigate how uncertainty surrounding future government actions influences supply chain operations, particularly inventory. So, previous research has examined how particular government policies like industry deregulation or the recent electronic logging device mandate shape various supply chain activities, but surprisingly little is known about how the more general policymaking process influences supply chain operations, and this is where our study contributes. As we've seen over the last few years, predicting policymakers' actions can be pretty tricky, given the various personalities and interests involved in government. This creates uncertainty for firms because access to critical resources, whether that's inputs or outputs, is subject to the ebbs and flows of government action or inaction. One way that firms can insulate themselves from potentially harmful policies and regulations is by stockpiling inventory. The idea is that holding inventory allows firms to continue operating and hedge against future loss of availability. We, of course, saw this stockpiling behavior in response to trade-related policy uncertainty in 2018, for example, when warehouses in the US and the UK were at record capacity, stuffed with a variety of goods. To better understand this phenomenon, we used financial data from more than 2,400 publicly traded companies in the US and matched this with policy risk and policy uncertainty indices developed by top economists. We found that firms differ in their exposure to the policymaking process. Some firms are sheltered from policy changes due to their size or political connections, whereas others are much more vulnerable. Interestingly, though, we found that this firm-specific policy risk on its own does not appear to induce stockpiling behavior. Instead, we found that firms begin stockpiling in response to the combination of their own policy risk and more macro-level policy uncertainty. So it appears that the interaction of the two is what matters. Just like the policymaking process influences firms differently, it also impacts industries differently. Some industries rely more heavily on government spending or have greater exposure to potential regulatory changes. In line with this, we found that policy-driven stockpiling behavior is also more likely in dynamic industries like consumer electronics, where variability and unpredictability are common even in politically certain times. Overall, our findings suggest that firms weigh the buffering or risk-reducing benefits of inventory against the cost of carrying extra inventory, and only when policy risk is paired with policy uncertainty or industry dynamism do firms resort to stockpiling inventory. Government policymaking is a fact of life, perhaps increasingly so nowadays, so understanding its influence on supply chain operations is important for both research and practice. For research, our study highlights the unintended consequences of the policymaking process, government action or inaction creates additional uncertainty and shapes supply chain operations. As I mentioned, inventory is a relatively costly way, depending on the product, to manage policy-related risk and uncertainty, so we call for future research to explore other supply chain strategies that firms can use to navigate uncertain political environments, such as shifting production locations or diversifying supply bases. For practice, inventory stockpiling ties up working capital, which may limit companies' abilities to invest in other important activities like expanding into new markets or hiring new employees. So we urge policymakers to take steps to reduce uncertainty surrounding the policymaking process. For example, policymakers can commit to a set of clearly communicated principles or a particular threshold for policy interventions, or they could further reduce uncertainty by exercising regulatory power only when absolutely necessary. As supply chain researchers, we see the world from a systems perspective and understand that actions have second, third, and nth order implications, so we have a unique perspective to offer to public policy discussions. So we hope that fellow scholars will also consider moving policy-related variables to the forefront of some of our future supply chain research. Thank you.